Might as well kind of get started. Let me get started really quickly with who we are as Horton Cloud Integrations, and then I'll kind of intro Derek and I really quickly. You could maybe start sharing screen now, Derek, and then I'll do the intro. So at Horton, really we are a dedicated systems integration firm, consultancy focused specifically on Azure integration services. That is our integration weapon of choice. We're probably one of potentially the only, but we're one of a few integration firms in the world that specifically focus just on systems integration and just on AIS. And then when I toss it over to Derek, and Derek in the presentation can kind of give you a lot more information on the pedigree with our experience in MuleSoft. But really where we help organizations around the world, we help organizations globally across a number of different industries, breaking down digital silos, connecting organizations for scale and automation, and really just paving the way for AI, given that most organizations are trying to find their path forward with AI, and integration and the services within AIS are a large part of that in helping them scale and automate. So hope you guys enjoy this presentation. Let me move to the next slide, Derek. I'll intro you and I. Who is this crazy guy, Tim, talking, and who's this Derek that you're going to listen to? So I am the growth and strategy director. I'm definitely not the person that you want to hear from when we're talking specifically about three paths of migrating your three-tiered, three-layered MuleSoft architecture. But Derek is our principal integration strategist. He has 25 years of experience in systems integration. He is also Microsoft MVP for Azure integration, which there's only one of three in North America. So we are all quite lucky to hear from Derek today. But Derek is also a former 3 times MuleSoft certified professional engineer, brings deep knowledge of MuleSoft architecture and a keen focus on enterprise integration and specifically migration to AIS. Given this experience that Derek has, that we as an organization have, we're really seeing quite a few 2024, and we're seeing, looking into 2025, that is really the year of MuleSoft migrations. And you'll understand why as Derek kind of launches into this presentation, and also how you can seamlessly move through this migration path. So anyway, with that, Derek, it's on to you. Oh, agenda, that's probably a good idea. Let people know what to expect here.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome everybody. So I pulled together this agenda for today. I'll quickly go a little bit more about us in the context of migrations. I'll touch on what our customers are saying, why they're reaching out, why they see value in migrating. Then I'm going to kind of do a quick walkthrough of the 3 paths. Obviously, there's going to be way more than just 3 paths, and it's a spectrum, but I wanted to kind of anchor on the first 3, because then organizations can see themselves moving between them. And then I'll walk through our methodology of how one of our methodologies on how to go from MuleSoft 3-layered architecture into an Azure 3-layered architecture. There's options around optimization at that point I'll talk to. Then we'll move on to our journey. So if you were to reach out and talk to us about migration, what does that look like? Everything from the initial, how do we get started, all the way through to post-production support type conversations. And then we'll end this video or this webinar with a Q&A section.
And if anybody has if anybody's got any questions, just drop them into the chat, and then I can, we'll probably leave Q&A to the end, but I can also, if it's maybe relevant, I'll interrupt you, Derek, but we'll probably leave all the Q&A to the end, but just type them into the chat.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. At Horton, we're really anchoring on migration. We see that there's a camp of organizations out there. There's camp that really can get the value out of MuleSoft. They see, they evangelize behind it. They're a larger organization with a larger team traditionally. But then we do see this, there is a facet of customers that just couldn't squeeze the ROI out of it. So what we do is we want to anchor on that. And for us, we come from MuleSoft background, and a consultancy that we focused on MuleSoft and implementation. So we did a lot of those, but now we focus on Azure. And so that puts us in a unique camp where we understand intimately how your flows work in MuleSoft, how they're deployed, data weave transformation files. We understand that, and then we can map that over to what that looks like on the Azure side. So I think that positions us quite nicely. What we're seeing is customers are looking at it from one of three, or the top three is, one is the total cost of ownership, right? So they traditionally will procure a larger license from day one. They start their initiative to try to integrate some systems. And they can't find that ROI. It's usually a large license, which we'll go through in a second, that they have to procure. And it takes some time to get into development, and it takes some time to get into QA, and it takes some time to get into production. So during that whole cycle, it's even hard to find an ROI there, return on that investment. And then even after they've deployed a few, we'll talk about some of the issues around cost. And so really when they look at Azure as a solution to that, it's really, when I see it, it's for pay as you go, right? So if I want to start prototyping within a development environment, I can really focus here. I can say, what am I doing? I can build it. I can test it here. I didn't have to go talk to a sales team. I just can start building my integrations. I don't have to, hit the upfront costs that go along with that. And then lastly, provisioning. So avoid that provisioning. So in the MuleSoft licensing model, when you purchased it and now you're thinking of migrating, you know that you have to avoid, or you end up with some compute that you can never use, because you always have to leave some there just in case one of your APIs need more memory. So you always have to have provisioning available to you. But you're really buying it in, and we'll get into it in a second, this notion of you're just buying vCores one at a time, right? So even if you're deploying a small integration or a flow or an app, you're really buying the whole vCore versus only partial vCores. So we're seeing that as a huge one, and it's really around ROI, it's total cost of ownership. Next one is, what we're seeing is this push in the ecosystem where, I don't want to be constrained in my architecture. And when I buy my licenses from MuleSoft, I'm provisioning certain aspects of it. So I can't use messaging if I didn't procure messaging. So that's going to change my architecture. A lot of organizations are seeing that as an issue. Taking advantage of things like AI, right? In the Azure space, AI being a leader, they see that there's a natural fit there that we can move in and use those. We can use things like Key Vault, Enterprise Key Vault, Entra ID for security, and logging and analytics and all the other capabilities inside there. Last would be, we're seeing organizations being asked to streamline their IT. So that means everything from what does my team look like? How are they trained? What conferences do I send them to? So we need some cohesion there. Can I use the same developer who built my integrations to build me my field web app that I'm looking to build out? And that really goes back to collaboration and productivity. We want to make sure that we're innovating as an organization quickly. It's really hard when it's a disjointed set of teams. We have a MuleSoft team and we may have an Azure team that's trying to innovate, and that usually causes some conflicts. So they're asked to streamline that, and a big way to do that is why have your integrations sitting in MuleSoft when they can actually just sit inside Azure, which speaks to the last one. So they want to minimize that attack surface. So that's from a technology perspective, but also from a platform perspective. So we'll get into that a little bit more. So the costing one, this one's usually the one that customers are reaching out saying, I can't find that ROI. So how does this look inside Azure compared to MuleSoft? And when you purchased your MuleSoft license, what I've done is I've said, you probably bought what they call their 2x4, which is usually 2 vCores. You get 10 gigs of RAM, and you have to procure that across your 3 environments, which is the 2 in production and the 4 lower, as you know. So I've used this as my scenario. And let's just say it's 250,000 US. Let's just say you were able to get a 30% discount. So I'm just going to use that rough order of magnitude number of 175,000. So this is for you to get started. You reached out, I need to build some integrations. This is traditionally what you would get. And it goes up from there. Now, I'll just anchor on this last one, but you can see there's kind of two estimates here. And we have the price calculator for Azure that you can leverage as well. But you can see here, what I've done is double provision vCores. I almost get another half amount of RAM here for all my environments. I get Key Vault capability, I got VNet, similar, no discount. And I'm seeing it roll in at 52,000 USD. So that's a substantial, that's 70. And if you weren't utilizing all of the vCores on this side, then you probably could look at even getting it cheaper and looking at the $33,000. So to me, this is compelling, and organizations are finding this out for themselves. So when we look at 3 migration strategies, we look at it in part like there's accelerated. And what that means to us is they want to get off MuleSoft before they have to renegotiate their license. So this is a little bit faster. What we'll traditionally do is look at when is that date. You probably have to give a 90-day notice to MuleSoft. So we probably want to have a couple months worth of extra room just in case there's some issues. And then we work backwards from there to pull a plan together to migrate all of your integrations off by that point. So that's accelerated to us. The goal is not to get more or re-up on your MuleSoft licenses. Which brings us to the next one, which is a phase decommission. And I'll get into why these are the benefits and the whys in a minute on each one. But the phase decommission is really what we see it as. You may have 10 vCores provisioned, have some complex integrations in there. So we know by the next time you're re-upping on your MuleSoft licenses, we probably can't achieve a full migrate. And you may not want a full migrate right away. So really what we want to do is talk about how do we reduce the vCore usage so that at least when you're talking to MuleSoft, you're asking for less. So we might be able to cut it in half on the first re-up and then maybe do a year or 2 renewal to get the complete. And the last one would be Augment. And that's to us is to say, you can have MuleSoft, but you can also have Azure. Same architecture, same deployment methodologies, but we can have 2. And so we're going to talk about that one as well. So when we think about accelerated, so this again is about, we want to migrate fully off MuleSoft, get onto Azure, and we do not want to talk about negotiating new licenses with MuleSoft. So the benefit of why they're doing that is we eliminate MuleSoft licensing cost right away. So we can see there's a cost savings for us. We can take advantage of these services immediately. So as we're decommissioning or migrating or lift and shifting your integrations off of Azure or off of MuleSoft and putting on Azure, you can actually start to leverage some of these services. And we'll get into some of that in a minute. In today's world of, the fast eating is slow in organizations, then they see it as an advantage to get using some of these services so they can innovate quicker. So this is usually, I know I want to be off of it. I want the cost savings, but I also want to start taking advantage of some of the new technologies that are out there, and Azure allows that to happen. So how we usually go through that is we will take a look at the critical path, see if there's any blockers there, identify them early, address them early. We look at the team, what type of team do we need to put in place to do a full migration in that timeline. We have what's called Horton MuleShift, and that's a tool that we've been building out, which does a couple things you'll hear me talk about in the context of like an estimate on what a migration would look like from a cost perspective, but it also accelerates us as we can take a MuleSoft flow and generate Azure Logic App workflows from them, kind of one-to-one, and gets us 80% of the way there. We touch it up and we deploy. So this is a tool that we have to accelerate that migration. And then we set the milestones to make sure we're achieving them so that, again, the goal is to be off of MuleSoft and not have to look at licensing. So obviously the benefits is they eliminate that cost right away. So we can look at how can we leverage those dollars that we did invested in MuleSoft, and how can we leverage that in new innovation over on the Azure side. Improved operations. You're going to hear me talk about things like stateful flows and how they help with operations. So you're going to they see that immediately. They get more of a robust enterprise API management strategy and tool set, not a kind of a pared down version of API management within MuleSoft. They can look at things like their key vault for storing passwords and certificates, and it's enterprise-wide versus maybe the thought right now is just thinking of MuleSoft as integration. Well, from an enterprise perspective, we can have that key vault be leveraged across the whole enterprise. We can leverage things like rules engines that are built right into Logic App, visual data mappers, and staying away from proprietary languages like data weave, a functional language that sometimes is hard to comprehend or modify. Being able to leverage things like Azure's Logic App's business process tracking, where we can surface events across a bunch of integrations and say, that is my business process, and see them light up as the integrations are happening. And then last, they achieve what the goal was of, how do I simplify my environment? So we have a lot of bad actors out there. They have nothing but time on their hands. They're highly motivated. So we can't compete with that being in our organization. So we need to leverage things like Azure security measures, right? So eliminate those components like a MuleSoft being outside of our environment, keep it inside Azure. So the phased approach for us is, again, what our goal is at the end of the renewal cycle, we want to use less MuleSoft, right? So less MuleSoft usually will relate to less cost. So we're able to reduce or achieve a better total cost of ownership if we can migrate some of those integrations over to Azure, which we already know is less expensive. Then we're able to start to get a better ROI across our integrations. What we're finding is when an organization takes this approach, it works well because as we decommission a set of integrations and we get that cost savings, it usually will help fund the next iteration of migrations. In this approach, we also see that it's kind of a crawl, walk, run approach on the team structure. So we don't have to, in the first one, right, kind of storm it, bring the team up the skill set really quickly. This one's a little bit more, we can take our time to get the training underway and get operational procedures buttoned up. So we see this as an advantage. So how do we do that? So it's no different. We would take, probably we'll take an earnest look at, okay, we might have a year and a half for the first one. So we'll look at, let's find the low risk, high value integrations. So that might be looking at vCore usage and saying how complex maybe it was just large files flowing through. Maybe the integration itself was just a heavier, but not very complicated. So we'll probably flag that as the first iteration. And then we'll say, okay, now what's going to actually be done on the second iteration? So we know at this point we reduced it by half, and that dollars flows into the migration on the second half. So that's kind of how we approach the migration. It's a lot like accelerated, obviously, but our goals are different. So the cost savings for decreasing the vCores is a benefit. It's kind of a risk mitigation. We're able to do it in more of a planned, a little less rushed, a little bit more thoughtful. And so that all those things reduce risks. So we want to take advantage of that. Same time, we'll also look at things like this notion of lift, shift, and in this case, optimize at times, right? So we're saying this integration here, it's our invoice receive flows. They're difficult. We don't get a lot of visibility into them. They cause us problems when they go wrong. This is an opportunity for us to look at optimization in this strategy, is to say, how can we use things like stateful logic apps that we can resubmit? We can see the payload that comes in, the payload that goes out on every step of our flow. So that's a benefit that we're seeing in here, is we're able to look at optimizations. And then obviously I keep hitting the ROI. So we're receiving ROI as we're decommissioning. The augment strategy is, we're seeing it from a couple different standpoints, and to be transparent, it's hard to rationalize a migration when you've just accomplished your integrations. You put them on MuleSoft, they're working. They might be a little harder to operate, a little harder to secure, but at the end of the day, it's doing what it needs to do. So going and trying to get a capital expenditure dollar amount to do another migration just to migrate it is probably not always on the table. So we see it as, we have to come up with a strategy that says, how do we get utilizing the new capabilities within Azure and some more advanced features in Azure, but we don't want to throw away what we have. So there's also benefits of, we're seeing customers say, well, I want vendor neutrality, right? So I don't want to be locked into one vendor. They know I'm using their platform for all my integrations. That's put me in a bad spot. I want to make sure that I have other opportunities to do integrations on another platform, and evaluate them in earnest along the way. If I see that, and that's strengths and weaknesses, right? So if I see that MuleSoft does this well and Azure does this well, then I can leverage them that way. I can use my vCores more strategically. And then what we are seeing is, after they've gone down this road, we are seeing them be able to receive a better ROI on new integrations and APIs that they build because of the cost savings. So we develop a hybrid integration architecture that combines both MuleSoft and Azure components. At the end of the day, it'll look like it's deployed from an architecture standpoint in one platform, but its deployment strategy is across two. So we can move between them. We can look at an API that was on the MuleSoft side, move it over to Azure, and vice versa, right? So we want to create that architecture that just has one approach, one set of patterns that we follow, and it kind of works out well that way. So then the other thing we have to look at is making sure that the team is trained and support. So there's different strategies on how we delineate the team, or we want to make sure the team is consistent across both platforms. So this one's, it's a little bit more thoughtful they have to be about it, but it can be achieved. So obviously the benefits are better pricing ROI on the new services, the APIs that you're deploying, being able to leverage the new technologies and the better technologies that Azure offers in this space. I can just start leveraging the pay-as-you-go. I don't have to call a sales team to kind of get the okay to provision some compute so I can start something. I can just start in earnest building. And then it also lays the foundation for future APIs and workflows. So this strategy is kind of a, let's get using it. Let's create duality in our architecture, but deploy it to do two different platforms, and let's kind of go from there and reassess. Part of our methodology is we do follow the cloud adoption framework. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I always say it, I encourage you to do it. It's usually like really thoughtful guidance on adopting the cloud. And so specifically in Azure Cloud Adoption Framework, which really shows you how to do that within Azure. And it's just feedback that they've received over how many customers and how many years, right? And they've delineated it into an adoption framework that we can follow. So obviously it behooves us to follow that. So part of this is just one strategy that we have. It's our integration migration wave methodology. And really what this means is we see it as two steps. We like to look at it from a technology step first, and then we'll say, okay, now we got across technology, let's look at business. So what does that mean? And I'll go into detail on each one of these, but we have to create a layer of API management that gives us flexibility at all the levels. So that at times we can point to the MuleSoft implementation, or we can look at the Azure, or point it at the Azure implementation, and it should act the same. It gives us ability, flexibility, and I'll talk to that in a minute. We then usually will work on the experience layer. Now, because it's usually well-defined, there's usually a RAML file that describes that, or an OAS file that describes that interaction with the client. For us to take that reference implementation of that API and port it over to Azure is pretty straightforward. We don't need the business to be a part of that. At the end of the day, we have test, unit test, integration tests that define that experience layer API. And we just have to assert on the other side, on the Azure side, does it meet that same requirement? So from us, we see it as a technology lift. It's not necessarily a business lift. So we can go off in the background and migrate those ahead of time. And so we see system layer APIs fit that same bill. So these system layer APIs is really a technology lift. As long as it's returning the same payload from the Salesforce integration or API or the Workday API, as long as it's returning the same payload, all the services above it should work well. And we don't need the business involved at that point. Which brings us to the last one, where this is where we know that the business has to do acceptance testing of it. So this one we'll usually leave last because we've got experience, our deployment cycles, our branching strategies, all of the complexities of picking up a new platform has been well understood by this point. And so now we can focus on, prior to bringing in the business, how do we migrate the process APIs? So the migration effort
Derek, sorry, go back. We just got one question that's related specifically to this slide. We've had two questions come in. I'll save the first one for last, but this one specific to this and the APIs within these three layers. The question is, do all APIs in MuleSoft have to be deployed using those three layers?
Say that again, do all
APIs, the MuleSoft APIs have to be deployed using those three layers?
No. And I'll see if I get this right. I hope I understood the question. But essentially, what this three-layer connectivity architecture that MuleSoft advocates for is definitely a design pattern that's been around forever, right? Like it's in the web world, it was called model view controller, but it was best practices to say you should have three layers. One layer should not jump another layer. You should go through the layers, and it creates benefits, right? Single pattern, so I only focus on the thing I need to know about, and I don't have to think about the others. So it has its place, but what we find in this migration to Azure is, yes, this architecture pattern is good and it works well if it has its place. But at the same time, we do see customers at this point going, hey, that API that we built, we'll never use it again. It's really for my payroll integration, and it's a heavy beast. I just need it to be in one workflow. And so what we can do is we'll break these down. We'll say, we don't need a separate system layer and a process layer and an experience layer. What is the flow? And let's build it that way, traditional kind of just a flow. But it supports it, right? So we're saying at this point, this is one methodology of migrating the three-layered architecture into Azure. But this is the point at which we say it doesn't make sense. It's an opportunity to look at that integration and say, did you get the value of creating these three layers? And if not, let's relook at it, and maybe it doesn't need, maybe two layers probably work well, right? So the answer is no, it doesn't have to be lift and complete shift. We usually do lift, shift, optimize at that point.
Nice, you got a thumbs up, so you nailed it.
Okay, good. So going back to migration effort one, I talked about that. What we want to do is, this one's kind of a subtle point, but it's important, which is what we want to do is put Azure's API management in place early. Because what happens is, it depends on how many clients you have using your experience APIs. Let's say you have 10 trading partners. That means you might have 10 APIs, URLs that you've handed out. And those traditionally, in some cases, will be MuleSoft-based URLs. So each one of those trading partners needs time to change that URL. We know that when making changes to software, it takes time to do a release cadence, right? So what we want to do is front that early and get those new URLs to them and say, in your next release, can you point at this one? And by doing that, we get flexibility of giving it to them early and at our discretion, and you'll see talking about, we can do canary testing down here. So we can push 80% to the new API and 20% to the old API, all through configuration, which I think is pretty valuable. And you'll see in the next slide, I'll kind of walk through it. And it creates at each level, it gives us that flexibility at each of the levels to, again, point at whichever ones we want. So we'll traditionally look at taking your YAML files. If you're already on Open API specification, great. But if not, we convert from your YAML to your API specification for you. We get the new URLs and we hand them out. We update kind of all of the layers to start using the APIM URLs. So what that looks like here is, you can imagine what we're doing is we're setting up APIM at the top, we're updating the configurations here, and today they'll point to the MuleSoft ones as, and then we hand those new URLs out, right, to all these clients. And then at our discretion, we can start to point it at the one. So in this case, once we've migrated some of these experience layers over, we'll start pointing them here, and we'll do that canary testing. We'll do 80% here and 20, and then 70 and 30, and we'll just keep repeating that until we're confident those all the experience layers are working as we thought. And the second part of that was to actually go through for each of the MuleSoft experience APIs. We build out the corresponding Azure ones. We front those with APIM. We do our canary testing, and we move on. This really becomes that. And this is, but this migration strategy is very much around layers. But there's other migration strategies you may be by lines of business, because we know that if you follow this 3-layered architecture, there's some dependencies that need to happen, right? And that needs to be converted. But by putting APIM in the middle, we get that flexibility pretty quick to be able to decide where we want those APIs to be pointed. Which brings us to the lift and shift. We've moved those Azure, or those experience layers. We're going to get rid of them. We don't delete them as much as we just don't route to them anymore. Process layers will be the next one, or system layers was the second technology migration we do. It's very much follows the same pattern, where we want to build out each of the system level APIs. We would, at this point, start migrating those credentials and certificates into Azure Key Vault, bind that to our DevOps pipelines, and then front APIM in front, so that we can route based off of how our canary testing wants to be deployed. So this is somewhat what you would end up with. So really, at this point, what we have is just the process layer. And again, this one's what we say more the business of the migration, which is we're probably looking at, this is where when we migrate a process over, even though we're going to do the canary testing, we want the business to provide that acceptance test at that point. So from a project delivery perspective, it's kind of neat that you would delineate that way to say, well, when do we, how much is this going to cost? How much is my platform going to cost? And lastly, what's the impact on my team and my organization? So with this strategy, we're limiting the business's impact, right? So we only bring them in at this point to do the full acceptance testing. And that's, we usually start with the less complex, non-critical business processes and move our way through. We'll look at the logical grouping of those processes and migrate them together because it makes sense. But again, with APIM in the middle, we can be pretty flexible in how we want to do that. And lastly, follow the canary testing. So we end up with an integration that looks something like this. And along the way, again, we can optimize. I'll maybe just talk about how we engage with customers on this journey. So traditionally what we say is in the exploratory phase of this, we really do a virtual coffee. We want to meet, talk, tell us about your organization, tell us how you use MuleSoft. Did you follow the 3-layered architecture? Did you What are some of the bumps you've seen? How were you able to receive ROI on some but not others? Let's really get into the weeds a little bit. Out of that, we want to take the usage report out of MuleSoft and some other questions that we have, and they're very great questions, because what we want to do is provide an estimate. And this is a rough order of magnitude where we'll look at it and say, based off your usage, we can, based off our experience and based off of our calculations in MuleShift, who kind of keeps building up this knowledge base, we can actually give you a rough order of magnitude on what it's going to cost to deliver the whole project from a delivery perspective. And that means get to code complete, right? So this is phase one of that estimate. Now, if we can look at that as an opportunity to move forward and say, I like what I'm seeing, you've given me not only what it's going to cost me to migrate, you've given me an estimate on the the Microsoft Azure compute that I can expect each year. You've described some of the DevOps to me. So this report that we provide in this estimate is quite detailed, gives you a lot to go on. From there, this is where you can engage with us, right? To say, have you made the decision on Azure? If you are really not solidified on Azure, we look at an optional POC. So this is something that we would look at. We define it we go into an Azure landing zone sandbox. We'll look at 3 integrations or 3 of the APIs. We'll traditionally walk you through moving them into Azure, kind of teaching how that works. And then we showcase it, so you get a real good understanding of what this looks like in Azure. But again, it's optional. If you know you're going to Azure and maybe you're on the accelerated path or the decommission strategy path, then what we do is we work with you and we refine. So at this point, we would also refine your report if you did do the proof of concept. If you didn't, we would jump to plan, which is us really breaking it down into work packages, estimating those, and then we refine that estimate again. So along the way, as the customer, you're getting to really see it come together and start marching towards a real number that works for you. Our goal with this is, as we go through the work packages and we work with the team to understand each integration, and this is kind of probably like between a 2 and a 4 week elaboration sessions with you, is we want to create these work packages. And what we want to do is give you a fixed bid price on those. So these ones will say, we're going to build it for this many dollars of this work package. And then we refine it back in. And then the second one, same thing, a fixed bid price. And then ultimately you have migrated. So that's where the delivery happens. We put together the team and we have different models of we do the whole thing to we kind of augment your team to do this. And so as part of that plan, you might already have architecture design documents. You might have a team that's ready to go. So in there, we can flush out what part of this are we participating in. And then last, once you do deploy and get it to production, then we do have this handover notion. We have training, we have ongoing managed support in production for you. So there's a lot here, but this is kind of the journey. And it's really these 2 first ones that customers, we want to talk to you about these ones. Do a discovery. Let's get you an estimate so you know what you're working with.
Hey, Derek, before you move on, this would be a good question, good spot for this first question that we got in from Susmit, specifically on the tool. So I mean, this is a great snapshot in showing how you would engage with our team, understanding that our team has the certifications on the MuleSoft and the Azure side. And then we brought up earlier, and this is the question, the tool MuleShift. So we've got the team and the tool. Just dive in a little bit more on that tool, because the specific question is, will MuleSoft only migrate, or will MuleShift only migrate the DataWeave files, the DataWeave language, to AIS, or the entire MuleShift app?
Yeah, good question. So MuleShift to us is a couple pieces. One is the estimating tool. So we've invested in always doing a feedback loop into our tool to say, we've delivered that project. Here was our estimate. how close were we based off of these data points. And so we'll always continually do that. So that's where MuleShift to us is doing a lot of that discovery around giving you a pretty good estimate, rough order of magnitude estimate right from day one. So MuleShift plays a part here. But up in the delivery side, it does a couple things. So if you think about, you have RAML to open API specification, it helps with that. So we're getting better and better each time a project. We're using some AI in there to kind of help us with that code assist piece that moves us from RAML to open API specification. When we think of it, you mentioned it, we have the data weave files, and those traditionally can become inline C# functions as an example, or a Java function. That's deployed on Azure Function, right? So we have options around what is this going to become to us, and we get, from an architecture standpoint, be able to decide that. But MuleShift, again, being the code assist, will help you kind of, again, get you there 80%. There's a lot of details. We're moving to it being able to actually write the requirements for that data weave file, so it can introspect that data weave file and tell you what the requirement was for that in the end. So that's pretty cool. And then last, we have the flows, and those become, in our world, we use Logic App workflows, and it's same, right? Low code, no code methodology around building your orchestration of that integration. So for us, this is what MuleShift does for us, kind of this part here plus this part here. So
yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's exciting. It's an exciting tool for us.
And for us, and that's kind of when I talked about these work packages that we produce, it's kind of like, that's why we can get to, hey, let's just give you a fixed price on that work package. Let's give you a fixed price on that work package, because we know that this is feeding in and helping us, making sure that we're getting pretty close on our estimates.
Cool.
So maybe just one last thing, why us? So we do end-to-end, say ND, but we do end-to-end, everything from helping you estimate so you can get a budget for the migration, all the way through planning. So we help you from an architecture, target architecture, blueprint, patterns, so that we know what we're going to do when we do that execution, all the way through post-migration support, and that's training, handover. We know that every one of them is custom, because every organization, how they utilized MuleSoft is different. So we work with you at that level, and that's those elaboration sessions, that's that discovery all the way through to design that we work with you. The big one is probably this one, which is our methodology, plus things like MuleShift, plus our team composition being MuleSoft heavy. When you speak to us about your platform and your MuleSoft implementation, we get it. And then we can show you how to move that over to another ecosystem. And that can be, toe the line, follow the 3-layered architecture because we really like it, all the way to there's some opportunity for optimization. So we have you there. Questions?
Nice. Thanks, Derek. Yeah, so there was 2 questions that rolled in there. We'll see if there's any others. I've got 2 questions. I mean, typically these are questions that come from organizations that approach us that just want to have a better understanding of the costing. So really, how can an organization understand their specific cost to migrate? Every organization is different, but maybe just kind of talk a little bit more, just a slightly deeper dive onto how we would cost estimate this for an organization.
Yeah, I mean, our goal is to make this low barrier of entry, right? So usually we have, this one's usually an hour. Again, I probably call it more of a virtual coffee, where we really, again, being principal strategist, I'll be somebody like myself will show up, like we can ask the right questions. You share as much as you can and feel comfortable. This really gets us across what we're dealing with. What we next want to do is give you this, right? And there's a couple questions in here that you get to answer, and this drives some of those dollars, right? So we can look at it and say, we're working on this together to give you this estimate. And at this point, we have enough information based off of that MuleSoft usage report, Anypoint MQ report. Like we can get enough information. We can see how many Mule messages are flowing. We can see your vCore usage. And based off that, we have multipliers that say this is what that's going to look like over on the Azure side from a compute perspective. So that gives you your compute. And then second to that, what is it going to be to lift and shift this over? That report keeps moving all the way through. So if you do a proof of concept, that report gets enriched. If once we get to the plan section, I mean, it really becomes refined at that point, because this is what we're saying. We're saying these are the work packages to do the migration in the order what we say, here's the attributes that we need that project to deliver. And so refined at this stage, which really does help us say what are the next ones going to cost. But again, we're refining. So from a customer's perspective, to get across this, we can help you get there quicker, because from an estimate perspective, because at this point, no obligation, no cost to you from here down, right? We're just trying to help you decide if this is this year or next year, right?
Yeah. And sometimes those discovery calls and sessions that's multiple calls as additional stakeholders in an organization are engaged and involved. Oftentimes at the estimate phase, depending on the information that we're given, especially on the MuleSoft licensing cost side, we can very easily generate ROI. So that helps defend this up the chain in your organization. If you know that there's an ROI, and one example of a recent migration that we just completed, it was a potential on a project ROI cost basis was about 6 months, under 6 months, in fact. So I mean, we're talking about months here, but this is really our job in this discovery and estimation phase, is just to really set you up for success, arm you with the information that you need up the chain to make this decision, and we want to make it as easy as possible and the whole process as easy as possible. Okay, I mean, really, I think you've sort of answered the second most common question. Is just kind of how do we jump onto this track? What's the tangible next step? Like maybe what does that discovery call actually look like? What information do you need from me so that we can kick this thing off and I can get to that estimate stage?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that we find successfully. So again, low barrier of entry. It's really, hit us up on contact@Horton Cloud. That's a fine. Send us an email. We'll set up a call pretty quick with you. You can hit me up right directly if you decide to do that as well. There is hortoncloud.com/migrate. If you go to that URL, there's other videos, again, to help make you feel comfortable. And there's a lot of really good information in there around some YouTube videos we've been producing. But really from there, what happens is we just meet with you. I can probably have the right team there. You usually see 2 to 3 people at that call that can field kind of cross-section of the organization, being the technical, maybe the person who looks at MuleSoft intimately and knows how it's set up, knows kind of what's been deployed there. From the business aspect, it's usually, we like to have that as well, so we can ask some pointed questions around the business side, which goes into it as well. But that, like I said, it usually takes about an hour. And there's been times where we obviously asked for a second hour because it was a little bit more complicated. From there, we'll send you kind of instruction on how to create or give us the data back. Nothing proprietary in there. There's no sensitive information in those reports. So we take that and we generate that report pretty quick. Again, we use MuleSoft to generate it. From there, we usually do about a 25-minute follow-up where we walk you through the report and hand it to you and say, that's where we're at now. How do we, if you want to move forward, we can keep refining this estimate along the way in that journey. But so really, from an investment perspective, we're looking at an hour and a half of your time to get you to a rough order of magnitude cost on both. What's it going to cost me from a capital expenditure to migrate, and then what is my compute going to be year over year estimated? And then to Tim's point, if you're open to sharing some of your licensing and some conversation around that, we can also be building that ROI statement in that same estimate document so that it's kind of one-stop shop for you. It's yours.
Yeah. So two more questions just came in, which are actually great segues to ending. First one, if people are going to start moving down this path, which are the key design patterns that can deliver quick wins and easy to justify?
That's a loaded question. Clearly, the talk track today was that one methodology following the cloud adoption framework where we kind of go layers. Those are traditionally pretty quick because to knock out a system level set of APIs is pretty straightforward because you have the reference implementation. We can look at that, hand it to developer. Here's, you know MuleSoft, so you know how that was written. You know how that connector worked. And I need you to replicate that in an Azure Logic app. You know how that works, so just make them do the same thing. I mean, that's a pretty quick win. It's not complicated, it's low risk, pretty quick. And we use MuleShift to kind of stub that anyway to get you 80% of the developer 80% of the way. So that approach of, if you can do layers and put APIM in the middle, it's a win. It's pretty quick, low risk, because you have that reference implementation. Where we do see the benefits is, I think the question was asked, do you always follow this 3-layered? And sometimes the answer is no, and it does simplify it because now you're taking maybe the trigger that you would essentially be a MuleSoft experience layer. You have some business process stuff that you do maybe for payroll, and then you need to connect to the payroll system and another target system. I mean, to take those and just put them in one is pretty quick, right? We know from a low code and development environment, we can knock that out pretty quick. So identifying those early, like which are the ones that you got value of having followed this 3-layer connectivity architecture, let's keep it because you found the value. That's what its promise is. It's a design pattern. It's an architecture design pattern that we should follow. But there's going to be ones where we evaluate and say that there just wasn't, the squeeze wasn't worth the juice that you got out of it. So if that's the truth, then we can simplify this, and it's one thing to deploy versus 3. It's change is easier because it's really focused on one thing, and we know as developers, by creating these layers does introduce complexity as well from a deployment, from a ensuring all the layers are working cohesively together. Whereas if you just do a low code drag and drop flow that just picks up a file, does some transformations and loads it into the finance system, that's pretty straightforward. So we see wins that way. And usually that drives less vCore usage as well, because it's just one flow versus now having to deploy 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, or 0.2, 0.1, 0.1. So we see optimization on the cost side as well by not following the 3-layered architecture as well. And messaging plays a huge part in enterprises. And we don't traditionally see that being talked about in 3-layer connectivity architectures, which we want to talk about.
Right. So it's, I mean, obviously there's no one size fits all here.
No.
Very obvious statement. But yeah, there's a lot of cost. There's a lot of cost and capability benefit here. I mean, really, to oversimplify this, if you can get an integration platform at a fraction of the cost with substantially more benefit, really, why would you not want to at least consider down this road? Which kind of so Smith had a final question here. I see he's typing. You might have a follow-up to it, but this is a really good ending question. Will Microsoft customers, or frankly any customers that are looking to migrate from MuleSoft to Azure, is there any discounts? Is there any licensing benefit if they're migrating over? I can answer slightly some of that, and then I'd like to hear your take as well, Derek. Microsoft they have what they call ESIF, the End Customer Investment Fund. Really, I mean, that oftentimes and best route there is to have a conversation with your Azure digital app and innovation specialist. There's always things that they can do given that you know, us collectively as Microsoft are highly motivated to see you move from MuleSoft to AIS. So yeah, I mean, there's that. Discounting, I mean, that's 100% up to you and the relationship that you've got with your Microsoft team. But is there anything I'm maybe missing there, Derek, that you would know of?
Well, there is the notion, there's reserved instances, right? So inside Azure,
Right.
we know that integration is very sticky, right? Like you don't build an integration that's going to last 3 months. You build integrations that are going to last 10 years, right? So very, very sticky. And with that, it plays in the hand of kind of Azure reserved instances, right? So I can reserve that compute to put my integrations on for a 3-year deal, right? So I'm going to see a reduction in that compute. it's quite high what we've seen. We've seen that the reduction be quite high on the compute side. But then, you know, to Tim's point, we've been 100% successful on receiving ESIF for customers. We traditionally try not to, if you remember that flow, we try not to use it for POC. It's more around, we want to use it for delivering something, like maybe it's the APIM implementation. We'll scope that and say, let's go for ESIF funding for that, because it really lays the foundation for the whole thing that Microsoft will understand, right? Like we're actually seeing what we are bringing over through that. So there's ways for us to work with your app and innovation specialists to really come up with something that works for everybody, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and we're happy to field that. I mean, there's partner led and there's sales led when it comes to that. So I mean, we're happy to help you navigate that. So that was the end of the questions. Great job, Derek. I thoroughly enjoyed it as always. I sit through a lot of these, and I learn a lot. And I hope everybody on the call was able to learn a lot. There's a lot of additional video content that we do, thought leadership content, where we dive deeper into these topics. We've specifically, last week, we actually published one on migrating your 3-tiered architecture. So those are all on our YouTube channel, Integration Insider. You can also access those on our website, hortoncloud.com. But feel free to subscribe and follow us on our YouTube channel, Integration Insider. There's a lot more information. And then Derek put his email up there. You know, Derek as an MVP, it's partially part of his responsibility to field questions from yourselves. So feel free to fire him an email at derek@hortoncloud.com. So with that, there's no more questions. If there's any last parting words you've got, Derek, and then we'll hit end. Everybody can get back to work.
Yep, to Tim's point, reach out if you have questions.
Awesome.